started 2 years ago, and it is initiated by the Albanian NGO The Bridge. And these panels, the topic of these panels are covering mostly the Balkan countries, and different kinds of topic, from the social political realm to the cultural one. Most of them are online, but also we've done some on site. And this panel, all these panels are also in cooperation, are organized in cooperation with AIESEC, which is Association Internationale des Étudiants en Sciences Économiques et Commerce. But the range of this international, the range of interest of this international organization is wider than economics. They are also interested in humanities, in culture, and so on. And this panel discussion is financially supported by the Open Society Foundation. So we thank both, we are grateful both to Open Society Foundation and to the IESEC. Now, the topic of this panel discussion is a hot issue today, is the enlargement of the European Union, both the experience of the countries that previously had entered the European Union, the Eastern European countries, Central and Eastern European countries, almost all the countries of the former Soviet bloc, well, all the countries of the former Soviet bloc, and even some of the former Soviet republics since the beginning of this century, and so except the countries of the Western Balkans, although they've been promised to the Western Balkan countries since 2003 at least that they would enter, but there being so far not much progress. Only recently we have seen some progress, and some has been expressed some willingness from Brussels, from the countries, the member countries, to integrate also the Western Balkans, and this is seemingly because of what is happening in Ukraine, and also they are talking of even enlarging the European Union to Ukraine and other countries more to the east than where they are the former Soviet bloc. And so this is on the topic for today. Let me introduce the panelists. We have Ivan Krastev from Bulgaria, who is one of the most influential intellectuals at the international level today. He is a senior fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna presently, or he has been contributing as an opinion writer in New York Times for many years, and presently is contributing editor in Financial Times. He is author of several books and has received prestigious international prizes. Now he's in Oxford writing a new book. Another panelist is Alba Cela from Albania, who is the executive director of, and head of the European program of the Albanian Institute for International Studies. Among her different fields of interest is European integration. And also she's an independent researcher who have been working as such for several international organizations. And the last one, and in this order they will make their presentation, is Milan Nič from Slovakia, who is currently a senior research fellow at the German Council of Foreign Relations. And among his fields of interest and of expertise is Central and Eastern Europe. Then after we will hear their presentation, they will be, like always, the same format, question and answer with the audience. Now, the floor is yours, Ivan.
Thank you, Bashkim. Thank you very much for the invitation. And what I'll do is much more try to show how the context has changed, because both Alba and Milan know much more than me about the actual integrations, both on the state of response of the governments in the region, but also what is the thinking in Brussels. But I want to make just three very simple points. And one is that the enlargement about which we're talking today is very different than the one that started basically with countries like Poland or the other Central European countries, and that ended with Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia. And the story back then was that Central and East European countries should change, and basically the West is going to remain in the way it was. And obviously, this is not how the situation looks now. Just today, the French President Macron gave kind of another big speech in the Sorbonne, and one of his major lines that had been quoted by everybody was that Europe is mortal. And basically, he believes that the rules of the game has changed both economically and geopolitically with the Russia's war in Ukraine, but also with the totally different economic situation and the rise of protectionism and kind of a trade wars. And I'm saying this because from this point of view, to talk about the enlargement of the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova, just in technical terms, and to believe that this is the same and that you can basically reduce them to closing and openings of the chapters, in my view, is just to use the wrong words. First of all, one of the countries that we're talking about, like Ukraine, is a country in a war. In a certain way, the whole enlargement was based on the idea that the big war is not possible in Europe, particularly after the end of the Yugoslav dissolution. And secondly, that European Union was very much surrounded by future members or friendly states. This is not true anymore. So as a result, obviously, we're talking about enlargement that have a different logic. And what is the logic of this enlargement? And the logic of this enlargement is first is that geopolitically, the question is not anymore how Europe is going to transform its neighbor. The problem is how Europe is going to defend itself, its values, but also its economic position in the world that is becoming much more hostile. And also this is happening in a moment in which primarily, but not only as a result of the Russia's war in Ukraine, some of the major assumptions on which the European Union was based had been questioned in a big way. One of them was that economic interdependence is enough to secure peace in Europe. And listen, it worked. The history, and this is one of the tragedy of the situation which we are facing, Europe is now much more the victim of its successes than of its failures. In a certain way, economic interdependence was certain things that very much worked between Germany and France in the wake of the World War II. And it very much works between countries with a very difficult history like Germany and Poland after the end of the Cold War. And it didn't work in the case of relations of the West with Russia in the last 10 years. And it was very clear that the fact that basically Europe has decided to buy as much gas from Russia as possible in order to make the war as impossible as possible, ended with the fact that what we see as a kind of a possible for source of security has turned into a source of insecurity. And at the moment the war started, basically Russia cut the gas and created a major energy price shock in countries like Germany, but not only Germany. The second thing which came very strongly, and I do believe is discussed very much today, and which was not discussion at all between the countries which were joining the European Union before, was the problem of the military power and to what extent the European Union can define itself. And the story was that Europeans, we managed to convince ourselves that in the world of tomorrow, basically military power doesn't matter much. What really matters is economic power, and what it really matters is soft power, the power of attraction. And when the war started, basically it turns out that it's not exactly the case. And even now, if you're going to see that Russia basically is producing between 2 and 3 times more ammunition than the United States and the European Union together, it tells you something about how basically the world looks like. Thirdly, and not to be neglected, basically the American security guarantees are not working in the same way, basically, that they would before. And the prospect of Donald Trump coming back to the White House and his strong argument that what is happening in Europe is Europe's problem, and the United States should not be involved in this, is putting the problem of European security differently. So suddenly when European Union start talk about enlargement, this is much more and first the problem of where are the geopolitical borders of Europe. And to what extent, basically, there is a European security space, which at some point should become also part of the single market, should become part of the four freedoms, which are at the core of the European project. And I'm saying this because if you see the reality on the ground, normally when a country starts joining the European Union, the last thing that is happening is that basically its citizen can move and work in the European Union. And one of the very, very last thing that is happening is that basically they can join the agricultural market and they can export agricultural products to the EU because it's one of the most contested area. But because of the war in Ukraine, suddenly Ukraine now has almost 1/3 of its population outside of the country, many of them in Europe, and basically they have the possibility to work. And on the other side, reluctantly, particularly with the opposition of some countries, basically they have the possibility to export without tariffs goods to the European market. And I'm saying this because my major argument is we're in such a different situation that trying to describe this situation with the words from yesterday, in my view, is going to be wrong. It's a totally, totally different game. And how this game is going to develop is differently. And then comes the story, if this is the case, what the country should do, particularly country that want to join, because one of the things which I'm sure that also both Alba and Milan can talk much more about this is that it's not simply that Europe is changing. It's not simply that suddenly we're facing problems that we have never been prepared to face before, and also politically, European societies are not where they have been, and probably after the European elections, you're going to end up with far-right parties, or at least parties on the right of the Christian Democrats, which are going to be number 1 in 9 of the member states. But basically also in the Western Balkans, the view of the European Union has been changed. You go in the opinion polls, and of course, Serbia was the country which was much more ambiguous in general because of a series of reasons. But you can see that many questions which are not contesting the European Union as a whole, but basically how and what you're ready to give and what you're ready to take. You're seeing this also in Northern Macedonia. Of course, my own country contributed quite a lot for Macedonians to feel in the way they feel. But in a general point of view, I do believe that both on the European side and on the side of the Western Balkans, but also Ukraine, and to be honest, Moldova is a very divided country. In October, there are going to be a major presidential elections and referendum. And to be honest, it's 50-50. This is not a situation in which basically people perceived joining European Union as something without alternative. There is an alternative. Some of us don't like the alternative, others like it. As a result of it, also what is happening, and this is in my view on a positive side, paradoxically, but because of this crisis, 3 important things happened, and in my view, I want to stress them when I'm trying to explain also what in my view is different. The first is that, strangely enough, while everybody is disappointed with Europe, today even the far right is not contesting the fact that if European Union did not exist, it should have been invented immediately. Suddenly, the war in Ukraine reconciled the far right to the idea that basically none of the European nation states has a capacity and power of its own to survive either economically or politically in this situation. Of course, they're dreaming about the different European Union. But unlike 5 years ago, when many of the far-right parties have been interested to exit European Union or to exit Euro, the problem is not basically to exit European Union. The problem is to change it and to be even much more open to govern it. The second thing that has changed is that countries like particularly Ukraine and Moldova, but let's seriously speaking, it's Ukraine is already a dramatic part of European politics. It's going to affect the results of the European elections, what is happening on the ground. For countries like Poland or the Baltic republics, this is not the problem of solidarity with Ukraine. This is about their own security. And for the first time, at least in some of these countries and some of the Scandinavian countries, the perspective of a bigger war between Russia and members of NATO and the European Union is not perceived as the fantastic anymore. If you're going to see the war budgets of these countries, you're going to see that it's totally, totally different world. But certainly, European Union was faced to understand the power of the nationalistic mobilization, and it was seen very much also in the case of Ukraine, basically. The fact that the idea is, are Europeans ready to die for Europe or even for their own countries is an open question. Ukrainians, basically, has answered this question. They're ready to die for this country. The problem is how long they can die and basically how much lives they can sacrifice. I'm asking all this because as a result of it, we stay in the conversation in which we're going to talk about the rule of law. We're going to talk about certain type of economic decisions to be taken. But suddenly the problem, are you part of the EU or outside, is becoming an existential question and security question for all of the countries. And this is a totally different choice. Before, the countries didn't believe that they're really making a choice. Before, the problem to be in Europe or outside of Europe was the problem, does Europe want us or does Europe does not want us? I don't believe that this is the case anymore. Secondly, I do believe that European integration is going to look differently because in certain level, particularly in the war terms, these countries are going to be pushed to join European foreign and security policy almost immediately. For the countries like Albania, this is not a problem, being a country basically part of NATO and kind of not seeing Russia as a natural pole of attraction. But for some of the other countries, even basically, we don't know how the next North Macedonian government is going to see it. In the case of Serbia, you see a very high level of hedging. On one level, basically, Serbia decided not to join sanctions against Russia. On the other side, Serbia is one of the big suppliers of ammunition to Ukraine. And this is what we are seeing on this. And last but not least, because of the fact that Europe now is existential choice, this is also the moment in which kind of a certain type of political divisions that were not seen before coming at the top of it. And I'm saying all this because what in my view is going to be totally wrong to try to believe that like before, the European integration is a much more process that goes through institutional reforms and depolitization. It cannot work like this. In a certain way, it's going to be a much more polarizing process than it looks, because the consensuses that have been there, both on the side of the European Union in certain extents, but also the consensus that we had on some of the Western Balkan countries is not here anymore. So we're in a different moment. We're using a different words, but it's also true that European Union has been taking dramatic decisions only through crisis. So if there is one thing that is difficult to imagine, obviously, is to try to see how in 5 or 6 years, countries like Ukraine or countries like Bosnia could be part of, in any meaning, of the European Union. But on the other side, it's very clear that they cannot stay outside of it because there is not going to be an outside. What has changed is the nature of the borders of European Union. Because before, European Union was a project based on hard budgets and soft borders. Now I do believe we are moving to a kind of a hard borders and probably softer budgets. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Johan. Allow me to highlight two of the ideas briefly. One, that the situation has changed so much that it should be conceived in quite different terms from what it has been conceived before. And secondly, what you said, that there is an alternative. So now I give the floor to Alba.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the Bridge Forum for inviting me to become part of this interesting discussion about EU integration and two regions, the Western Balkans, and if we consider these three countries together as they are named the trio, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, although a bit more conditional, but certainly part of the discussion and part of the EU decision-making. We all talked so far about the difficulty to find words, new words that can reflect the new context and the new challenges. And I was also trying to find a word that could encapsulate all these years of the Western Balkan region trying to become part of the EU. It's a long story, and in a sense, it's full of hopes and dreams and vetoes and disappointments. And one word that I found that could encapsulate it is a word that psychologists use, is cognitive dissonance. It's a sort of disorder and a sort of pain that a person feels when the values and the actions, or the values and the words, contradict each other. And I think there is a cognitive dissonance on a collective level between what is hoped, what is declared or said on both sides, and what finally happens, or the decision-making that happens. I say this because of the current status of the credibility of both the EU and the process of integration. Of course, these go hand in hand together, but the process was always fragile, and this credibility was always in line in certain moments and milestones of the integration, but the credibility of the EU was more stable as a union, as an aspiration and a vision. And I think that there is also a little bit more threat to the credibility of the union itself after this long period of waiting for the entire region. It is not a joke for a human life, 20, 30 years. It is a little period, it's a short period in a time of a country or a region, but for people who come out of dictatorships, of isolationist regimes, and who have a strong hope and a strong project for the future, it is a long time. We mentioned the Republic of North Macedonia. It is a very clear but also painful example. So many twists and turns, a real roller coaster. And now, if you see it now, if you take a photograph, it seems like nothing has happened. It seems like no progress has been made. So this is what I mean by this pain, like a cognitive dissonance that can describe it as a metaphor. And the example of North Macedonia is more dramatic, but is the same thing that affects all the countries in the region. In this difficult context, the embarkment of these three countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, it's a very interesting process. So in the difficult context of the process of integration, we have now three more countries that are invited to join this path. And in sort of, we are invited to join the same roller coaster of developments. And why is that? Because I think that the EU still stands very undecided what it wants to do. Many people say it's a dichotomy, whether it wants to reform internally or enlarge. I think there's even the third choice, reform and enlarge in the same time. So there are three options, and there is not a clear choice, or sometimes one party seems to gain dominance over the other in the discussion. And as long as I think one choice is not clear and decisively taken by the majority, then we will have the same roller coaster of developments, which will leave the countries in both these regions quite dissatisfied with the outcome. One more thing, that in these countries, these three countries that are now joining us, that they will face is a parallel multiplication of what I call hidden alternatives to enlargement. Berlin process, common regional market, all these things that are some sort of constellations of regional cooperation or platforms are indeed mechanisms that are given to these countries in order to support their patience. It is because the process of EU integration, a clear process with clear conditionality, has not worked, that there has become a need to become creative and invent different kind of constellations with different names and budgets in order to placate these countries that from time to time express their disappointment. What all these other alternatives have in common is a lot of visibility, noise, and fanfare, and very little practical achievements, even though some of them have been in place in a long time. What comes to my mind when I consider Western Balkans and the trio countries? Two regions, very different, but surprisingly with very similar set of challenges in the process of EU integration. Rule of law, human rights, media independence, all the spectrum of conditionality it's common for both of them, but their history and their context is very quite different. And for me, coming from more than 10 years in civil society, a practical necessity that I feel is the need to multiply the opportunities and mechanisms to talk and to know each other. All the people in civil society in the Balkans know each other, have common projects, have common networks, but we don't have this kind of communication with the countries in the trio region. And here I would like to actually commend and express my kind of admiration for the Open Society, because it is a front runner that is trying to establish some links through events and projects between the Western Balkans and the trio countries. And now I think the ball is in the field of the EU to help in creating these platforms and links and networks of cooperation. There are a lot of opportunities, financial projects, events that can assist. And I think it's very important because of two things. What the Western Balkan can transfer to the trio is the lessons learned for all the reforms, mainly based on topical separations. And what the trio perhaps can transfer a little bit to the Western Balkan is a sense of enthusiasm, a sense of emotional support and courage, because staying in the waiting room of Brussels for so long will take away the enthusiasm, even from Albanians, which still in the surveys are 80 or 90% in favor, but if you go a little bit down in depth, they also have a disappointment with a long time of waiting. This year is a strange year in many ways because of the two elections, the EU elections in June and the US presidential elections in November. What these elections create is some sort of limbo. It's a lot of stakeholders feel a little bit paralyzed, mostly waiting of the outcome and then seeing how they will adjust their policy and their decision making. When it comes to the EU elections, maybe I'm a bit optimistic in this case, or perhaps even naive, but I think the threat in the case of the EU elections is less dramatic. Yes, there is a concern that we all share about the rise of far-right parties, but I think still the big parties like EPP or the others, if they behave responsibly, they can mitigate a lot of risks. There's a very interesting paper from the European Policy Center that actually analyzes this in detail. And even in the scenario of certain numbers of the extreme far right in the parliament, proposes mechanisms that could mitigate the risks. When it comes to the US elections, more things are at stake, of course, because then issues of security, issues of support for democracy are at stake, and then it becomes even more important for the Union to take more responsibility for the region. In the case of a Trump administration, which is not desirable for many of us working in this field, but not very unlikely, it is quite likely, it is then on the Union the responsibility to provide the contrast and the alternative. And the completely different messaging is needed in this case, much more clear and much more decided, because then it's sort of the region is left alone, as there's a lot of unpredictability and hostility. Just remember the first Trump administration, what it meant for our region. It meant people in the administration like Richard Grenell. It meant a lot of ad hoc, opportunistic, unpredictable decision-making and planning, which did not help stability or progress in the region. And instead of a conclusion, I think that the story of reforms in the Western Balkans holds a lot of lessons learned for the countries that are just embarking in this path. And the story of Ukraine has become the locomotive of the enlargement, mainly on the rhetorical level. When you consider the real decision-making about enlargement, I think our expectations were much higher than what really happened, but it is important that the discussion has changed, and it is important that now we take the opportunity to engage more stakeholders and, if possible, create these links and networks so that we can advocate together now as two regions that are sharing the same path for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alba, an old guest of Bridge Forum. She has participated and given interesting contributions also before in the previous session. And I would highlight also a few ideas from Alba's presentation. First, the one of the concept of cognitive dissonance in relation to our topic. And second, the strange year in which we are in, the limbo year. Now I give the floor to Milan.
Thank you, Bartim, and thank you also to the Bridge Forum for having me. Listening to Ivan and to Alba, I realized to put aside several points that I prepared for the experience of Central Eastern Europe, so the so-called new member states from 20 years ago. I will mention some of it, but I would like to rather continue on the perspectives on the future of EU enlargement and on the future of Europe and the security and geopolitical challenges of today that both of my predecessors or two speakers mentioned. So allow me to improvise more than I wanted, but I'll come back to several streams in our discussion so that we can maybe in the Q&A develop that further. And feel free, please, to come back to some of these points of the last 20 years of the lessons, the Central European lessons from enlargement of 2004, which I underline, very much agree with Ivan. It was very different enlargement because the EU has changed in the meantime, the world has changed, and even the criteria and the accession process today is a different one. It's much more tougher, and it responds to different challenges, for instance, on rule of law that were not there before. So my three lessons that I want to highlight from the time of 2004 Big Bang enlargement was, number one, a public opinion that at some point it got accelerated. It involved 10 countries rather than smaller groups, and Western European public opinion, and I was reminded about that a few days ago in Paris, discussing with a very good French pollster, who said that, look, when we come back to looking at the sources of Marine Le Pen's party, now going to win third European elections in a row, he said it already started with the referendum in 2005 and the whole concept of Polish plumber. And when the French public woke up to the fact that there is this big enlargement that they were not prepared for, because the political elite of France and also of Germany did not do a good job of explaining and preparing their own society for very important historical sort of watershed of enlarging the EU, which was beneficial to the countries. There were a lot of transition periods, for instance, on movement of workers, but they produced, on the one hand, a lot of diplomatic energy. They managed enlargement and the technical process without actually explaining to their own societies what's happening and how beneficial it is to their own countries and economies and to Europe. My second point is about timing. Central Europe entered the EU at the time where it could still benefit from good economic sort of climate, that there were EU funds inflow and so on, but it was only a few years before the global financial crisis struck them and the Eurozone crisis. So yes, you had the convergence that you can look at growth, economic growth figures. Poland, for instance, had a golden age between 1995 to 2005. It has, in statistical terms, outgrown countries like South Korea, Taiwan, or any other mid-sized countries around the globe. And I think it's fair to say that next to Southeast Asia, there was hardly any other region in the world that benefited so much from globalization as the new countries of the EU from Central Eastern Europe at that time, because EU integration or EU enlargement for them was also, in a way, access to a global market through the EU single market. So that benefits were there. But if you look, for instance, at the Czech Republic and its conversion rates, it stopped at about 2009, and it never returned to that rate as before. So yes, my own country, Slovakia, has also almost doubled its GDP. Its GDP is now at the level of all Western Balkan countries, 6 Western Balkan countries, including Albania, combined. So we are in this was hugely beneficial. However, few years after 2004 enlargement, there was this double clash of global financial crisis and Eurozone crisis that stopped convergence. And then you had succession of other internal crises. So my third point is that the timing was mixed. The ability of the new so-called new member states from Central Eastern Europe to shape European Union and to become politically influential inside its institutions was also limited. One of the major things inside the EU when it was enlarged was the referenda on EU constitutions in France and Netherlands, in all member states, that produced a huge European crisis. So I remember coming to Brussels as a new researcher, as a young researcher, and looking around the EU institutions where officials from our countries, how they climb up in European Commission. You cannot become Director General overnight. It needs, you first need to become director of a department and so on and so on. And 20 years after the Big Bang enlargement, if you look at the European Commission, one thing is to have a commissioner. That's your right as a member state. But if you look at how many directors generals our countries have had, not many. Part of the reason is another turning point, a negative turning point of 2015. That was when the migration crisis really produced a huge dissonance. And especially the Visegrad countries, after the political change in Poland, became more of a sort of internal camp or critical camp of confrontation politics towards the EU institutions and Brussels, led by Viktor Orban. And that slowed down a certain gradual building up of influence and positions within the European institutions that you could see until then. Again, to give an example, 2014 was a time when a very tough compromise was forged at the European Council on the what later became Paris climate package. Not easy to agree between various camps within the EU, including EU Eastern countries. But at that time, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic agreed with French and Germans on certain measures that were not harming their economies too much. They were able to produce unity. And we lost something in 2015, and only now, with change in Poland, maybe we are coming back to it. I think the big challenge there was a challenge of political leadership and a new generation. Before preparing these points, I looked at what I wrote about on the occasion of the 15th anniversary of EU enlargement in 2019, and I was naive. I said that the new political generation coming to power in the capitals of Central and Eastern Europe will be more European. Now, what do you see? You see the return of the old generation in Donald Tusk, Robert Fico. Look at Slovenia, Janez Janša is still leading the largest party. So if you ask, where is the new generation, the new political leaders of Central Europe that are more socialized in the EU context? You have some. New Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala is one example, but there are other exceptions. You have still dominance of politicians from the late 1990s that were there when we entered the EU. What does it mean for the Western Balkan countries? what does it mean for your new political generation? Maybe, the paradox that you have is that all your established political leaders are still too young. Look at Serbian President Vučić or Albanian Prime Minister Rama. They were generation younger than Viktor Orban, Donald Tusk, but they are so dominant in your politics that I don't see too young generation in Western Balkan countries coming that could bring in their countries to the EU. And if they are, like Zoran Zaev in North Macedonia, they are not helped by the counterparts in EU capitals. Let me now come back to the challenges of today and where the enlargement process is. I think what war in Ukraine produced for European Commission was basically a demand from European Council at Versailles, do whatever it takes, use the enlargement process or accession process as a tool to save Ukraine as a country. And to provide framework for future reconstruction and transformation into European state at whatever territory it's controlled. The enlargement process was used as a tool to do this geostrategic challenge. And with it, another crisis country, Moldova. The European Commission then adjusted a stagnating accession process to this task. So what is happening in the last 2 years are two different accession processes. One that is improvised on the go towards Ukraine and Moldova based on their deeper free trade DCFTAs, which allow them to connect to the single market in a more extensive way than the Balkan countries. And you have then the old accession process with the older candidates. There is political insistence that both of these processes are merit-based, but they are two different modes. And without the first one, without this accelerated accession with Ukraine, there would not be new momentum for the Western Balkans. So what is likely to happen under the new EU Commission? I think it very much depends who will be the president. And it's not a given that it will be Ursula von der Leyen. And I think Macron's speech earlier today was another reminder of that. The next commission will start with the in-depth pre-enlargement policy reviews in some sectors, including cohesion policy, agriculture. And this will bring home to member states a very sort of tough policy challenges, how much it will cost, how many, what they will have to sacrifice. And the paradox is that the biggest losers of the next enlargement will be the enlargement countries of the 2024 Big Bang enlargement. So the Central and Eastern Europe in terms of cohesion policy and agriculture policy. Poland will have to sacrifice the most. So given all this and the fact that next EU budget, which will start in 2027, will have to be negotiated in the next 2 years, what the next European Commission will propose, and it's already in some strategic documents of the outgoing Commission, is a gradual integration. So the current enlargement countries, including the Balkan candidates, will be gradually integrated into selected policy areas before accession, because that's more realistic to happen than have agreement among all 27 on admitting new members with all these tough compromises and then wait for ratification processes. I think what is a new challenge and also a lesson from 2024 enlargement is that a lot will depend on communication and on public opinion in the existing member states, as well as on in the aspirant countries. If you have support for EU membership in Serbia down to 35%, it's partly to its own disinformation and political manipulation of their own media, but it's partly reflecting also disillusionment and frustration with how long this process lasts. And now my last part is on the stakes, how context has changed in today's Europe and global world, and why the stakes are so high for today's for current leaders. As a matter of fact, tomorrow we will have an internal seminar over a draft paper by a German colleague, which is in a way a response to Macron's speech of today. And the text starts by, and I quote here, "The dangers of failure and disintegration of the European project today are much higher than at any time since the early years of the 90s, or one can argue since the early days of the Cold War." What's striking for me in looking at my colleague's paper or listening to Macron's speech from today is that they are not talking too much about enlargement. For them and for the French president today, the biggest challenges were at the global level and the internal disconnect in European policies. So basically, if you simplify, what he was saying is that the European model would die unless certain steps are taken in the next 5 years, in which he would face Germany with a very different approach. And unless European budget will double, it will have its own resources, and there will be heavy investment into defense and strategic industries through new Eurobonds. This is how he defines the biggest internal challenge. And he will face, of course, a very different approach from Berlin. This is internal battle which will take away attention and political energy from enlargement. Now, what the French president didn't mention is that the biggest challenge for enlargement and for also being able to prepare or to address these challenges, the biggest internal challenge in the next cycle, next 5 years, will be in 2027, presidential elections in France. Because at present trajectory, Marine Le Pen has the highest chance to succeed. And the French public opinion, which some of you might be based in France are better informed about this, but it's striking that in both camps, in the far right or in Macron's own party, you don't have an honest discussion about war in Ukraine and enlargement. Both camps prefer to push this to the side. The far right, because they don't want to point out their connections with Russia and finances, and Macron's party, because they know it's not very popular. So what I'm worried is that this mistake of 2004, where public opinion was not prepared, will catch up with us right after the election campaign to European Parliament is over, and the far right, Le Pen and others, will come up with the alternative of Polish plumber, Ukrainian, I don't know, truck driver, and will simply dream up or beat up and increase resentment against new wave of enlargement against Ukraine. And because Ukraine is bigger than any other candidate countries combined, and because it attracts much more public attention, it could kill the current momentum. And I will leave it at this. I'm sorry if I over overtook, or if I took more time.
Thank you very much, Milan. So there were, I think, several important issues that were approached in Milan's presentation. I would highlight especially one of them, which seems crucial to me, the generational issue in relation to what is political leadership. It is thought-provoking, this idea. And now the questions from the audience, if there are any questions. Well, hoping that, yes, there is one question from Arben. So everything is like improvised. So the European Union is just like improvise about being interested in one country or another. To whom is Arben, to whom is addressed this question, or to the three of them? To someone. Well, Milan, since you are here.
What I was trying to say is that because it's now existential for the European Union, the war, the Russian aggression to Ukraine is not only about Ukraine, it's about European self-defense. Then only in crisis it is perceived as existential crisis, and therefore the enlargement is reshaped and reoriented towards Ukraine. And as an effect, it is also being moved forward with the Western Balkan countries, and those governments that understand that now they also need to deliver something, deliver on some of the criteria, like Montenegro government is doing now. I think they will be upgraded because there is this window open for them. And I hope that Montenegro will get unblocked to close some chapters. It will show to other Western Balkan countries that it is possible to move forward also if you are not Ukraine, Moldova.
So I'm hoping that other questions might come from the audience. I would put a question to both Ivan and Alba. I've read several analyses about the project of the idea of the enlargement currently. The change of the criteria for the enlargement of European Union quite recently. And this is related to the war in Ukraine. So these analyses tend to stress that the criteria is mainly now geopolitical. It's geopolitical security, not so much compatibility with European values. Do you think that this change of criteria would affect the European, the values of the European, the proclaimed, let's say, the proclaimed values of the European Union, Ivan?
Thank you. Listen, European values are proclaimed, but European values, there is also European political process. So do you believe that the fact that you have the rise of the far right and so on is not affecting the way Europe is perceiving itself or not? I do believe that we are slightly living in a kind of a bubble in which we try to believe that European Union is going to remain in the way it was. European Union is dramatically changing. And it's changing on several levels. One is, first of all, European Union is feeling very much threatened its very existence. When before you're going to have one of the major leaders of the European Union talking about the fear of disintegration? So now basically you're trying to mobilize people through fear and not basically through the fact of self-confidence. Secondly, the war in Ukraine, of course, created a momentum of unity, but the truth is that Europe was behind Ukraine when Ukraine was winning. And the moment basically the Ukrainians starts losing, and it was not difficult to predict that, particularly with the level of support that they're getting, it's going to be very difficult for them to resist. You're trying to see that all different European societies are much more trying basically to focus on certain things that very much divides them domestically. One of the things that we are not talking about is demography. European societies are aging and shrinking. Europeans' role in the global economy is changing dramatically. And one of the major points of Macron was, while Europeans are very much trying to create an environment in which the most important is how to compete between ourselves, in a certain way, there is no major European companies that are really competitive on a global level. And Europe is more and more economically squeezed between the United States and China, and we are going to face deindustrialization, and basically economically it does not look well. Why I'm saying this? Because economic self-confidence and economic power was part of the soft power of the EU. I'm always very afraid when, in a moment of crisis, people become very visionary. And with all my respect for the French president, I remember that the worse the Soviet Union was doing, the more visionary President Gorbachev was becoming. And addressing more and more kind of bigger issues. So in a certain way, obviously, European Union is facing a crisis, what it is going to be like a union in the next 3 or 5 years. And from this point of view, how exactly the countries like Serbia or Albania are going to fit here and there, you should not be surprised that this is not the major question that is basically troubling these people. The French-German relations is critical because the problem is what Macron wants is massive collective borrowing, which means that also we're talking about subsidizing of European economy very much on the model of what Biden is doing or what the Chinese are doing. But the money is not going to come neither from Bulgaria nor from Slovakia. Secondly, European societies became very much mistrustful to their leaders because on the other side, you're talking to a president of a big country, but his support is around 20%. And the support of the German government is basically on the same levels. So we're talking about the change of political leadership in the Western Balkans. But of course, I'm sure that most of them are totally kind of envying Edi Rama for his popular support in Albania. So you have a major crisis of the system. And part of the crisis of the system is that it comes because the world around us has changed, and Europe was not prepared for this world. And it was not prepared for this world because we have been the biggest beneficiaries of the previous one. And this incredibly easy can be seen in places like Germany, where everything that Germans were proud with suddenly are turning against them. The fact that Germans managed to pacify their mind, that they don't have an army and so on, this was what the Germans have been praised for. And then the people are saying, but where is your army? Secondly, which in my view is also critically important, that you can see that even on the level of values and so on, many of the type of lessons that we got from the World War II are not working for us easily in this world, which is much more shaped by the anti-colonial and post-colonial sentiments. The Cold War narrative does not work. The attempt of the Biden administration to make the major clashes, a clash between democracies and autocracies, didn't really fly easily outside of Europe and the United States. And I'm saying this because one of the major mistakes that countries of the Western Balkans will try to believe is that you know which is the European Union that you're facing. But the real problem for these countries is what is their place if they're not in being part of this big discussion, how you're changing the EU, how you're changing economically, because demographically, the countries in the Western Balkans are facing some of the problems of the EU, but they're facing it even on the highest level. If you see the demographic projections of what is going to happen and how many of us are going to stay in this part of the world, it's going to be quite scary. This is small countries that are totally not prepared for welcoming and basically being capable to integrate big migration flows. So from this point of view, economically also, what was making Central and Eastern Europe so successful in the 1990s, for example, low salaries and this level of competitiveness, low taxes, it's not going to fly in this story. One of the things that basically others say, we're not going to tolerate your low taxes. And by the way, we don't have a labor force. I'm saying this because, in my view, it's very important to try to understand that we're in a totally different conversation. And this is why, for example, the idea, can European Union discipline the Western Balkans? Which exactly European Union? With Marine Le Pen president on France and Meloni president on Italy, I don't know who's going to run, to basically try to discipline them on what? On exactly what kind of values. And I'm saying this because the very logic of European Union is much more becoming defense union, but not so much in military terms, where Europe is underperforming totally, but also in economic terms. Some of the major bets of the European Union, for example, that we are going to be a regulatory power, and this was very strongly betted on in the level of technologies. But now when the American technological sphere and the Chinese technological sphere are really decoupling, whom exactly we're going to basically regulate? Are the Americans going to allow us to regulate them or the Chinese? So I believe that, in my view, it's very important the Balkans to try to get that we're in this different situation. And this is also an opportunity to be part of these discussions, because at the same time, it is critically important several things, that this country cannot simply basically stay nowhere, because now there is a major kind of claims and ambitions. Russia is not simply a neighbor anymore. Basically, they're in an open war with the West, and not that they have a particularly important strategic interest in the Balkans, but if this is going to help them to push and disunite, they're going to do it. This is a totally confrontational situation, totally different. Turkey is also looking for its own place, basically. So I'm saying all this because then the logic is different. And of course, we're going to talk about economic policies in which it should fit. And I very much agree with Milan that they're going to be kind of integration of policy area by policy area. But this is not going to be the bureaucratic process that we were talking before. And for some of our countries, it's also going to be very painful. Because honestly speaking, for the first time, and this can be seen very much in the behavior of the Serbian president, he's asking the question, can Serbia be the next Yugoslavia? Can we not hedge between these two blocks? Are we not going to benefit much more doing this? So I do believe from all these choices and all these concerns were not there, neither on the Western side, nor on the side of the Western Balkans. And even I'm not talking about Ukraine, because of those of you who are not in a certain way following Ukraine very closely, we're going to one of the most kind of difficult periods that you can imagine. And in the next 5 or 6 months, the situation can dramatically change. And also the decision of the Ukrainian government not to basically service the Ukrainian citizens on the recruitment age in the European capitals and so on is also going to change. Ukrainian society is also something that we have never been interested in. In the beginning of the war, we have been living with the idea that the Ukrainians can do nothing. And after they basically showed their strengths, we started to live with the idea that they can do everything. And they're not going to be impacted by these 2 years of war. So this is what I see. And this is why improvisation is not simply the lack of interest. The story is that, in my view, the biggest problem of Europe is that we try to find our place in the world, which is quite hostile to us. And this time, the whole of the world, and the possibility that the United States is also trying to basically see its interest in a different direction and saying the European security is a European problem, which easily can happen, is putting even more pressures, and even some institutions that before we have been taken for granted in the way that they're going to deliver cannot be taken for granted anymore.
Thank you, Ivan. There are 2 questions. One is again for Ivan by Ellen. But first, I would like to know Alva's opinion on the question I asked before, and it was addressed to her again. What is her comment about this analysis that the criteria for EU membership are changing now and are more giving more priority to security security. So how does it affect the membership of the enlargement of the European Union in the Balkans, given the problems, the political problems that the Western Balkan countries are having? And a certain tolerance for the sake of security. What is your comment about this analysis?
I think it's important to note one thing, that the criteria in a certain way, at least formally, changed even before the war in Ukraine with the new methodology. And here we return actually to the role that France plays, and especially during the time of President Macron. You remember the debate in 2018, 2019 with the new methodology that was supposed to overhaul the entire process of integration ended up being just a different kind of categorization, because practically conditionality is the same. What is called fundamentals now was always very important, those chapters, but now we have it in different clusters. And the purpose then was to make it more meritocratic, more technocratic, more focused on the rule of law. What it actually accomplished was actually negative effect for North Macedonia, because it was the time in which North Macedonia expected to be rewarded for the Prespa agreement. The French, which came up with the new methodology, did not follow up with advocacy and support for North Macedonia. And when the situation with Bulgaria started, another kind of improvisation, and I also don't share a lot of enthusiasm for improvisation in crisis solution mode, was to include a bilateral issue in the negotiation framework between the two countries. This now, which is enshrined in the negotiation framework, will become a precedent for all of us. And here I actually address also, there was somebody asking about relations between countries. The biggest problem that the region faces when it comes to integration now is bilateral issues. And here is not only Bulgaria and North Macedonia, here is also the potential tension between Albania and Greece, which is also a roller coaster. Sometimes it appears, sometimes it becomes aggravated, and sometimes it becomes softened. For the moment, is slightly aggravated, for example, and this is an asymmetrical tension between EU member state and candidate state in most occasions. To address your question, whether the formal conditionality has not changed, the need of the countries to comply with EU common defense and foreign policy has come due to the actions of certain countries in the Balkans, mainly Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, because all the other four have complied and have endorsed the sanctions and everything else when it comes to positioning towards Russia. Is there a risk that by stressing geopolitics and foreign or defense policy, we might lose focus on the other reforms that are more traditionally connected to the EU values? As Ivan said, it's hard to think about this in time of survival. It's an equilibrium and a kind of calculation that you make under very severe threat. I actually think it is important for the countries, if they are in a process of integration, to make clear foreign policy choices and not to play the ball in two kind of different fields if they are formally committed to this process. But it is the role of other stakeholders to make sure that the equilibrium is not ruined. The role of many actors in civil society in monitoring other processes that make sure that this common or security policy does not come at the expense of other necessary reforms.
Thank you. Now there is a question from Ellen to Ivan. I want to know even the perspective of Mr. Ivan. How does the issues of unresolved problems between Balkans affects the impression, or let's say the perspective of the EU have towards our countries?
Listen, of course, it affects them negatively. First of all, in the beginning, 10 years after the Central Europeans entered the European Union, the idea was that there was a major success. And exactly because of some of the figures that Milan was saying, there was a major economic transformation. And the idea was that during the financial crisis, by the way, many of the Central European countries were performing better than West European countries, particularly Poland, who didn't have a recession. And then Bulgarian and Romanian accession was perceived as much more as disappointment. There was a lot of talk about corruption. There was a lot of talk that the countries were not prepared. The question was, is it not too early? In order to understand what is happening, and particularly when you see basically the dynamics of the Bulgarian-Macedonian relationship, for us, it's always kind of, we're seeing European politics and this conditionality very much divorced from domestic politics, because before the idea was that the more you integrate in the European Union, this is where your public is supporting you. And this was true in the beginning, because in the beginning, when you ask questions, and this was true for Eastern Europe as a whole, and this was true for some of the South European countries, whom you trust more, Brussels or your national governments, basically people tended to say that they trust Brussels more. And the idea was, we don't know what they're doing in Brussels, but they're kind of a control of our own corrupt elites. So paradoxically, mistrust your own elites was contributing to the trust in the EU. This started to change with the financial crisis. This also very much changed with the migration crisis, where basically many of political leaders on the right managed to convince local publics that probably in Brussels, they could be more competent than us, but they care less about you. And this was quite important psychological change, because one of the major stories to understand about Bulgarian position on Macedonia was that for a long period of time, Macedonia was not a hot political issue in the country. It was very much kind of on the agenda of one of the very small political parties, which was coalition partner for Borisov's government, but it was not critically important. But government was in crisis. There was thousands of people protesting on the street. And the most important story that you're sending with this is not that you're saying something to Macedonians, but that Bulgaria is saying no to Brussels and to Washington. This was this idea of symbolic sovereignty. We in the European Union, we want to be treated differently, and we're going to say no. By the way, on the Macedonian side, and this is quite interesting, part of their reaction, but much more legitimate, was the same. After having Ohrid agreement, which was difficult for them, listen, changing many things in your symbolism is not what you want. In a certain way, this is kind of a enforced sex change without asking for it. So basically, they ended up in a situation in which, seen from the point of their own voters, basically Macedonian pro-European government looks kind of a totally with any agency issue. And here's the paradox when you go on the subject. Probably you don't know, but for a long time, Bulgarian governments over the last 20 years was strongly kind of opposing the idea that there is a Bulgarian minority in Macedonia. Because Bulgarian position was that there is no minority, because Macedonians are Bulgarians. So suddenly, basically, we decided to recognize that there is a Bulgarian minority and ask this to be put in the constitution, which was before the position of the Macedonian government. Because, of course, they basically said we are ready to recognize Macedonian, a Bulgarian minority, but we are not ready to recognize that there is no such type of a nation as Macedonian nation. But because of this kind of a humiliation game, because of this kind of a symbolic politics, which was totally decoupled from any type of a substantial politics, you ended up in a situation both public opinion suddenly became so inflamed that for the governments, it became difficult on both sides to do anything. Of course, Bulgaria was in a very privileged position, being part of the European Union. And this is one of the things that this was a precedent that before was between Slovenia and Croatia. We are seeing this with Bulgaria and Macedonia, Greece, Albania is the same, because one of the countries is within the European Union and the other is not. And when you're within the union, you basically can put pressure, you can veto certain things. You are in an asymmetrical position. And I'm saying this because this is one of the things that strangely is happening. And I have been studying over years different disintegration periods. And I have learned one thing. Disintegration happened not because the majority of the people suddenly decided that they want to get on their own. Disintegration normally happened by accident. You have a certain process that starts to develop, and suddenly people are not where they have been before. And of course, paradoxically, in many countries, the pro-independence majorities were the results of the disintegration and not the reasons for this. Probably only a Carmen of the people here is going to remember that in March 1991, there was a referendum in the 9 republics of the Soviet Union where kind of a huge majorities have been voting for the reform Soviet Union and not for independence. And 9 months later, of course, after military coup and so on. But you can see the public opinion from this point of view, and this is what is really kind of dramatic. European integration is much more captured from the logic of the domestic electoral politics, and it comes in the moment where the governments feel very weak. And on one level, the weakness of the government and disappointment of the publics is created this type of a dynamics, which is kind of a self-defeating for both sides.
Thank you, Ivan. Now a question from Angela. How does the European Union engage with neighbors and help us to fill their criteria? Milan, would you answer to this question?
I want to react on what was said previously on 2019 blockage by France. And let me come back maybe to this question. I believe in 2019, there was a window of opportunity for Macedonia and Albania to be upgraded, and France blocked it for reasons that had nothing to do with North Macedonia. And the lesson for me from that is that it's so difficult to come back to that momentum. And there is a when you talk to French officials today, they still feel it was a big failure and big mistake. I think part of the reason why the French EU presidency 2022 tried to forge some compromise between Bulgaria and North Macedonia was this. Because without the French veto, I cannot imagine Bulgaria doing that to Macedonia. You know, they saw it's possible. And sometimes these bilateral quarrels between two countries can destroy something bigger. You know, can destroy opportunity for more countries. You know, for Albania, the big problem and curse is that the idea of decouplement, you know, decoupling from North Macedonia didn't get traction. So it's not treated on its own. It's always treated in a package with Macedonia, which is not fair. Croatia was enlarged separately. You have now Montenegro in perhaps moving forward separately. And meanwhile, again, I'm now looking at Albania with certain, you know, lost hope, because there is meanwhile another bilateral quarrel with Greece that will complicate things and will undermine the cause of Albanian chance to advance in the integration. Because I think what we are looking at in the coming years is gradual integration into the EU single market and into strategic areas, strategic policies, where candidate countries will be encouraged to accept the regulatory framework from Brussels, and also given some money through the growth plan or otherwise to integrate to policies. But you need, at many stages, you will need unanimity from the current member states. So having a quarrel and being seen as not doing something to overcome that quarrel with one of the member states is not good. And usually after European Parliament elections, things are not ideal. So now the fact that Belarus is being put on the candidate list of Nova Democracia, you know, it's just, you can see that the public opinion in Greece and political process was captured by that quarrel. But I don't know how strategically smart it was to get into it from Albanian side. I'm getting into sensitive things, but there are these crossroads of European integration and accession process. We are, I think, facing now one now in this year, and it's not good to miss out that window. So I see one country among the Western Balkan 6 which has now a chance to move forward and capitalize on that, and that's Montenegro. And I think we should cross our fingers for that in the coming weeks, so that they will get so-called IBAR, so internal. I even don't know how to what that means, but it's an assessment from the European Commission that would allow them to go through the interim benchmarks in the fundamental chapters 23-24 rule of law. So the legacy of 2020 new methodology, when France was trying to get out of its own of its veto, which would then allow them to close other chapters, because you need to first reach interim benchmarks in the fundamental chapters, then to go further. This bureaucracy will stay with us, this technical process, but it requires political will to move forward. So I don't know whether that's also an answer to the question that was there, Bashkim, but this is the way. So don't start new bilateral quarrels. Try to bring political will to unblock them. And the big discussion among the member states is about qualified majority vote in the accession process. So Germany is heading that. There is a non-paper with Slovenia, which proposes to other member states a significant reduction of these veto points to only, I think, opening and closing chapters. They will be this decision, I think, will be put on the table by the summer under the Belgian presidency at the GAC, so General Affairs Council. But it's enough if it requires unanimity. So it's enough if one country blocks it. And what I heard from Budapest is that they are aware of 3 or 4 countries, member states, that don't want this, and they want to kill it before their presidency. And one of those countries among those countries named are, no surprise, Bulgaria and Greece.
Thank you, Milan. There is a question from Thea. What lessons can be learned and improved by the situation that is now everywhere the same? Alba, would you please answer to this?
Before I answer, only one sentence. It is an example of the dissonance and perhaps even hypocrisy that written in paper, the principle for each of the country is regatta principle. The EU officially has not changed the regatta principle, so to each their own progress according to their own merits in the reforms. But de facto, different from paper, we are in couples. We are in a couple with North Macedonia. Sometime we have made a delay for them long time ago when we had the political crisis, and now it's reverse. Serbia has been in a couple with Montenegro. That's not any longer a couple after Ukraine because of the different, but they were both called front runners. And if you remember, there was also talk about them joining quite soon. And then there is what they call in the corridors the desperate couple, Bosnia and Kosovo, because they have so many problems with statehood and borders and everything. So this is an example of this dual narrative and dual kind of decision-making, that you say there is a regatta principle against the Big Bang principle, because there are people who advocate for Big Bang, for all the 6 countries to get together, but in reality you form weird couples which are not consensual. These are not consensual couples. Is the situation the same everywhere, and what can be improved? Many things can be improved, actually. The decision-making and the narrative from the EU can be more honest. If they try to move forward with sectorial integration, this should be clear, and this should be explained very well to the public, which are the benefits of that, not to be perceived as kind of a deceptive alternative to enlargement, but to be explained properly as a step-by-step beneficial process. And on the side of the Western Balkans, much can be improved in relations between each countries and in the internal reforms. And there was somebody who asked how the EU can help through providing the technical, the financial, and the political resources that are necessary to make these changes. There are many options, but when you don't have an honest discussion, when you have a discussion that is based on many dual calculations, then the tools lose a lot of their relevance and lose a lot of their potential to yield a good and proper impact. And I think after the elections, really the discussion needs to be more honest. There are many papers out there. There was also the paper from the German and French experts, how to make the EU more ready for enlargement, flying in high seas. It was called like, in which it discussed qualified majority and everything. But the discussion is to be open and honest with the region in order to see what really are the tools that can make a difference, whether it's through sectoral integration or not, whether it's through these alternatives of regional cooperation or not.
Thank you very much, Alba. Any other question from the audience? We have still a couple of minutes.
Can I challenge, can I ask a question
please,
to Ivan?
please.
Are speakers allowed to have questions too?
Yes, please. Yes.
So Ivan, you said that next few years, 2-3 years, everything will change. So to put it simple. And yet, last 2 years, since the war full-scale war in Ukraine started, the approach from Berlin, from Scholz, Chancellor Scholz, was status quo plus, and it had worked so far. So the question is, why not muddling through? Because what is one characteristic for today's German political class, you can put this lack of political will. Outside, there is a huge domestic crisis at many levels. The constitutional court destroyed their budget, so they are in stress. Their country is stressed in many ways when others expect leadership from them, and they are saying, sorry, we are not capable to lead because we are in constant coalition crisis or political crisis at home, which will not change until next federal elections in 2025. Therefore, status quo plus is the best we can expect from this Berlin.
I'll try to answer quickly, and unfortunately after that I should try to leave because I have something after 7, but this is the major thing that has changed. Now the crisis is at the center of Europe. The real problem, to be absolutely honest, is not a Greek-Albanian conflict, and it's not Bulgarian-Macedonian. There is a French-German one. And this is a conflict about where the European Union should go, and it's not about qualified majority. This is about the economic model of the European Union, what you're doing in a situation like this. And this is why, in my view, one of the things that is changing is, listen, European bureaucracy was a very positive force, and is a very positive force because it stays in disciplines, it creates predictability. But European bureaucracy, in a certain way, is going to lose a lot of its power exactly by the fact that we are going to see a major transformation in one way or the other. Even if you believe it is a status quo plus is creating a crisis of its own, and it basically pushes for the speeches like we have today, which is basically pushing Germany to react and to say what you're doing or not doing, and if you're not doing this, you should feel responsible for what is happening. And I do believe this is the story. There is one thing that stays with me, and I'm going to say this before leaving. I started to be interested when they made public the discussions in the Soviet Politburo, what they have been discussing after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I went to see the first kind of meeting of the Soviet Politburo, and it was totally devoted to the problem of the agricultural reform. Because they have been working on the agricultural reform for such a long time, that basically they put the fall of the Berlin Wall into varia. And I'm afraid that so many things are happening, and economic also dramatically, politically what is happening. Listen, do you believe that Mrs. Le Pen being elected, and probably they're going to be a different type in Germany of a government, you can end up with European Parliament in which they're going to be very flexible majorities. The centrist party can have a numerical majorities, but to be absolutely honest, the centrist parties are very, very much divided on their own. So Bulgarian Socialist Party, I'm not sure that this is exactly why the Spanish Socialist Party is on most of these issues. So as a result of it, we have a crisis of the model. And from this point of view, to expect bureaucratic solutions, so this is not going to work. And also, unfortunately, it's not our countries that are going basically to shape more decisively what is going to be the future of the Union. So if I was staying in Albania or Northern Macedonia, my story is use all the resources that European Union have, but also try to consolidate domestically. Because one of the things that basically people are not doing is the idea that our countries are going to be reformed from outside. In the moment where basically France and Germany are trying to reform themselves, in my view, is not the thing how it's going to work. And this is why I do believe that one thing Macron was totally right, the rules has changed. He was talking about globally that the rules has changed. And we should be ready to recognize it. Because now when I remembered Chancellor Merkel saying that we're living in a different world with President Putin, she was right. The problem is all of us is living in the real world. And this is what is changing.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you very much. And thank you, Alba. Thank you, Milan. And thank you, everybody, for attending us, for listening, and for asking the questions, and for all this interesting dialogue that we, discussion that we had this evening. So, goodbye to everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much for having us and for the evening conversation. Have a good rest of the evening.
You too.